Today's episode of the Energy Question podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces challenges every day, and the events of the last 2 years have caused massive disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hi, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackman. I'm your host, David Blackman, and our very special guest today is Ann Bradbury, the president of the American Exploration and Production Council, one of the great trade associations that represents the oil and gas business, really the large independent producers part of the oil and gas business in Washington, D.C. Ann, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, David, for having me. It's good to talk to you.
It's great to talk to you, too. For those who don't know, Ann, when I used to co-host a radio show called In the Oil Patch Radio, Ann was our guest a couple of times, and just a fantastic guest that we had on that show. So I'm really pleased to see you again. Before we, we're going to talk about the elections and potential fallout from that related to the oil and gas business. But first, for our viewers, talk about AXPC, who the members are, what you guys do there in Washington, and how things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. So AXPC represents the leading independent oil and gas producers in the U.S. Our focus is onshore production, and we represent companies, all of the leading companies in every major basin, from the Permian to the Bakken to the Marcellus. And we like to say that our companies are the authors of the American energy revolution, which took this country from a place of energy scarcity to energy abundance and provided all of the economic, national security, and climate benefits, in fact, that came along with that.
Yeah, and that's really true. That's such a great point. I've worked for a couple of AXPC member companies during the early stages of the shale revolution. And we were during those years from about 2009 through 2016, when I sort of retired anyway out of Lynn Energy. Our members at AXPC were probably drilling 70% of the new shale wells being drilled in the country. Mm-hmm. Is the percentage still around that high, or is it kind of decreased somewhat over time?
The latest study that I have seen is that independents produce over 80% of the oil and around 90% of the natural gas. Now that goes from the small independents to the big independents, but right. The production in the U.S. is overwhelmingly from the U.S. independents.
Yeah. And people need to understand that, because it's not just about big oil. I mean, exactly. ExxonMobil and Chevron have big positions in the Permian Basin, mm-hmm. and they're going great guns with their operations, but really the wells are being drilled and the great preponderance of the production is being operated by independent producers. It's always such an important distinction to make.
It's really important. And what I should have followed up with on your original question is that AXPC's purpose is federal advocacy. That's, we do a lot of different things, but that is sort of our reason for existence. And the reason that our companies invest in us and, our advocacy work is because the business models and the policy implications for the independents is different than it is for the other segments of the industry. And so, my companies, I think, really value making sure that perspective of the independent producer, the upstream focused producer, is really heard and understood in Washington.
Yeah. So let's talk about the election. I know I was guilty as anybody about getting caught up in an anticipation that there was going to be a red wave election this year. And that, of course, didn't really come about in any big way, although the Republicans did gain control of the House of Representatives. And, I wrote a piece about it shortly after the election, but I'd like to get your view on it. I mean, it seems to me that you almost have to believe that Americans are somehow fairly complacent with the current situation related to energy and high prices. And I don't know, what do you think it all means?
Yeah, so a couple takeaways that we're all still kind of digesting what happened and what it means. But a couple takeaways. I mean, there wasn't a red wave, but there wasn't a blue wave either.
Right.
There was kind of no wave. It was really a year where incumbents were very much favored. For the first time in about a century, it is possible that no incumbent senator who was running for re-election got defeated, which is just remarkable, right? And about 97% of House members who were running for re-election won. And so that I think, that was really remarkable. So it really was largely about there was a huge power of the incumbency this year. But secondly, I also would say there actually was a red wave, but it happened in red districts. And what I mean by that is, like, the Republicans really outperformed the popular vote nationally. I mean, they swung like 6% more votes than they did 4 years ago. The problem was most of the uptick was in already Republican districts. And so it didn't flip as many districts. And that increase in Republican votes actually wasn't seen so much in those independent districts or those, really competitive districts. So I actually think that's a really interesting way to look at this election as well, is that Republicans were fired up. Most of them were, had incumbent representatives representing them to begin with. So it didn't flip as many seats, unfortunately. And then thirdly, I would say candidates really mattered. Candidates were important. We saw definitely candidates that were more aligned with Trump fared poorly. And interestingly, I think Democrats saw this coming, because in some of these seats, Democrats spent to promote in the primary the Trump aligned candidate. And when that candidate then won, they didn't fare as well in the general. And then when you saw in places like, the Georgia governor's race and the New Hampshire's governor's race, like, those candidates did really well when they had their own brand. So I think that was another important takeaway.
Yeah, another really interesting thing that I thought, just as an aside, was how this red wave was so huge in certain states, like Florida, just enormous in Florida. It was big in Georgia, big in North Carolina, and big in New York State, of all places. Where Republicans flipped 2 congressional districts and didn't win the governorship, but got so many more votes than they had in past elections. And so it's just really, and your point, I think, about the quality of the candidates is so well taken, especially when you look at Pennsylvania, where, you had Dr. Oz, who's not a bad person, but I'm not saying he's a bad person, but clearly he was a carpetbagger candidate. And he got tagged with that identity right up front. It could never overcome it. And and so that has, of course, big implications for the Marcellus Shale, the way the elections came out there in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that was really unfortunate, because, our biggest natural gas producing state, now is represented by, 2 Democrat senators, which is unfortunate, neither of which is particularly friendly to industry.
Despite Mr. Fetterman's protestations.
It depends on what day you ask him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But Florida is a fascinating case study. I mean, DeSantis, outperformed, Trump's performance 2 years ago with every single demographic, minority, women, ages, all of them. And having that strong performance at the top of the ticket really helped pick up 4 seats in Florida.
And then you have this situation and for the Permian Basin and your members who produce in the Permian, where you had this, fantastic election for pro-energy candidates in Texas, and just a horrible outcome in New Mexico.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you've just got that bifurcation within that producing region that's going to have really significant implications. I think, are you hearing anything from your members about their concerns there?
Absolutely. And the fact that, all of New Mexico is now represented by Democrats is
Yeah,
just staggering. Redistricting has had an impact on a lot of these elections, you mentioned New York, that certainly played a role there. And it certainly played a role in New Mexico. But the fact that, the heart of production in New Mexico is, now going to be represented by, from what we understand, a not friendly Democrat, is really concerning. And especially when you have issues like non-attainment,
yeah.
that they're struggling with at the federal level, and just to not, and all of the federal lands issues that New Mexico producers are struggling with, to not have an advocate representing them in Washington is a huge disappointment.
Well, since you brought up the subject of the non-attainment thing from EPA, the threat to hold the Permian Basin in non-attainment under the ozone regulations, I was at a conference last week and spoke to a couple of people who said they're really expecting to see something pretty soon from EPA on that. We haven't had a lot of news recently. I'm wondering are you hearing anything about movement within the agency to move in that direction?
I think that's likely. I think we're hearing it would probably be a next year item, just because they have a lot on their plate,
Yeah.
and the region will certainly have something to say with that. But it does, we are hearing that this is something that they're actively working on at the agency.
Well, let's talk about the Senate. Joe Manchin, for better or worse, has been a very key player in this Congress that will be leaving at the end of the year, but he will remain a key player with his party still in control. And I assume he's probably still going to be the chairman of Senate Natural Resources Committee.
Yep,
But
that's my expectation.
yeah.
Yep.
And so I guess that, one of the questions that really occurs to me is a friend commented to me last week that, well, yeah, even if they have 51, Manchin's going to still be this critical voice on energy issues because he'll have Sinema with him. But I said, it's really probably not necessarily the case, because her issues with that Inflation Reduction Act bill way back last year were not about energy so much as they were about taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think if let's say the Georgia election goes to the Democrats, to Senator Warnock, is Joe Manchin's power really going to be diminished there in the Senate on that key committee?
I don't think it will be diminished on the committee. I do think it will be diminished in the overall Senate, because he's not, he's certainly going to be a very influential voice, but he doesn't have that sort of kingmaker status that you have when it's a 50-50 Senate and you can't lose a single vote. Now they've got a little bit of a margin to play with, and he's got he's got a little more flexibility to say no, and they still, will have the ability with, Vice President Harris to be able to move agenda forward. So I think, it is very, very fortunate that we do have the House as a backstop, because if Joe Manchin's not going to be for something, then the House of Representatives probably isn't either. Safe bet. But there are also issues like nominations that only go through the Senate, that I think it actually makes him less of sort of a, I don't love the term kingmaker, but I can't think of a better one, where he's, he kind of gets to give the unilateral thumbs up or thumbs down because of a 50-50 Senate.
So the question of nominations is actually becoming a pretty key one right now, I think, with the talk about attaching Senator Manchin's permitting bill to the Defense Authorization Act, because what I'm reading at least is that the quid pro quo would be that he releases his hold on the renomination of the chairman of FERC, whose name I'm going to forget right now. Yeah. And what are you hearing about that? Is that, do you think I mean, just my own perspective, it's hard for me to believe Manchin's bill has the needed votes to get through both houses of Congress, even in this lame duck.
That
But I
is
wonder what
that
you're
is
hearing.
very accurate. And I think that, there's not a lot of time. Permitting reform is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And I think Republicans in particular feel like they were not consulted in negotiating that Manchin permitting bill. And I think they are keenly interested in permitting reform and feel like we should start over next year and look at real permitting reform, that they can also put, make sure that their priorities are represented as well. And I've heard from both Republicans and Democrats that, in a narrowly divided Congress where you're probably not going to get a whole lot through legislatively, permitting reform is a potential area where you could see action, because there's great interest from what I would call the environmental Dems, who know that you have to build things in order to build out renewables. You have to build transmission lines. You have to be able to site solar projects, things like that. And they are willing to at least consider some oil and gas related permitting reform as well. Probably they would want to see some strings attached to that. But I think they know that that's the deal space, right? Is, the oil and gas industry wants certainty on federal lands and the ability to build pipelines. And the renewable industry wants transmission and the ability to build some of these big projects. And so hopefully there's the opportunity to work on that in the next Congress, but it's not going to happen in the lame duck.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that, actually, because I do think it would be best to start over and do a bill that is really real permitting reform and not this kind of scam that they had going in September. I do wonder if you talked about the environmental Democrats. Do you think they understand that this energy transition that they're talking about is going to require permitting, not just for transmission and wind farms and solar arrays, but also for an awful lot of hard rock mining activity in the United States? Do you think they really understand the magnitude of what's going to happen there to meet the mineral requirements for the battery industry?
It's a great question. I think some of them do. It's probably a relatively small percentage that are honest about that. But we have seen work to bring some of that mining back to the US. So we're less dependent on China and other places for those critical minerals. That certainly is not without controversy on the Democrat side, but, we're seeing a bit of that. And, do they understand the scale? Probably not, but I do think you do hear calls from some Democrats that, we need to, be able to, produce some of these critical minerals ourselves and not just offshore all of this. So I think there's the potential for maybe a little bit of progress there too.
Well, one of the outcomes of the election that I wrote about recently was the thought that, this is something of an endorsement with the Democrats really potentially even gaining a seat in the Senate and 2 governorships. It's almost could be read as a sort of an endorsement of what the administration has been doing related to energy, if they want to read it that way. And my view is it's probably going to embolden the administration to act on some of its worst impulses, like a windfall profit tax, for example, and maybe even some export restrictions under the claim that would somehow enhance our energy security. What do you think about that? Are we likely to see, increased impetus from the Democrats behind actions like that?
I am totally with you on that, David. I think what you're going to see is a doubling down of, what President Obama called the phone and the pen. You're going to see a lot more both regulatory actions, but also executive actions from this administration on different climate and energy policies. And I think they're really going to push the envelope of what is legally allowed. With just the change in the one House of Congress, it shuts off a lot, most legislative avenues for them to be able to accomplish a lot of their goals. But that doesn't mean that a lot of what they want to do can't be done through executive action. So, you mentioned, for example, export restrictions. That is something that is very, they have that authority to be able to do without an act of Congress. And I think you're going to see a lot of calls for that. We've heard the environmental left call for the declaration of a climate emergency, and that would open up, additional new authorities to the administration. And then, we're already expecting an absolute regulatory tsunami from EPA, from DOI, from the SEC, that has kind of been slow to build, but we're seeing it, starting to come our way as they finalize some of these regulations or propose some other regulations. But the impact of that has not been felt yet, and that's definitely coming in the next 2 years. So luckily there are certain things that need an act of Congress. For example, windfall profits tax is not something that they have the unilateral authority to do. So there will be a congressional backstop for some of these, for some actions, but other things that are within their authority, I think we should all be prepared for.
Yeah. So you a lot of your members produce in the Permian Basin. It's the hottest oil and gas play really on the face of the earth, and has been for a while now. On putting aside the election, there are operational issues that, of course, have been kind of slowing the increase in production out there, hiring, supply chains. I was at a sand conference last week, and sounds like most of the sand issues have really been alleviated out there. But I wonder what you're hearing from members about operational issues, the challenges that they're still facing out there.
Yeah, they're pretty significant. I hear the most about steel, both steel, the price of steel piping, and simply availability. And that's a huge issue. Labor shortages, huge issue is, unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, a lot of our companies had to lay down rigs, and it really kind of decimated the service industry. And it's really, they're having a hard time bringing those workers back. And that's a huge constraint. And, so even, companies, I think that are looking to grow are having trouble finding the rigs and finding the workforce and finding the materials that they need. And then everything is so much more expensive.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Right. I mean, this, but, anywhere, I hear, increases anywhere between 15 and 50%, for various, components and materials. So, it's, capital costs are going up significantly. And so that's definitely an issue as well.
What about the Marcellus, the other big, the big natural gas producing region up there? I know there have been concerns. Everyone I've talked to from up there has talked about concerns over takeaway capacity to take the gas to market out of the basin. What are you hearing from your members on that? Is there any prospect for alleviating any of that soon?
Yeah, that's the big challenge in the Marcellus, is that, they simply, they're maxed out in terms of what they're able to get out of the basin, essentially. And because, so many the pipelines have to cross so many state lines, it's really hard to get a pipeline built. One part of permitting reform, of the Manchin permitting reform proposal, that we really did like was it essentially mandated the construction of Mountain Valley Pipeline. So that's not, that unfortunately that part did not happen, but that is, over 90% built and should be a no-brainer. Right now, the Northeast is really concerned about a cold winter. And I think there was a piece in the Financial Times this morning about how they're, importing LNG from Trinidad already, paying European prices because they cannot get gas from Pennsylvania up to Massachusetts. And it is, these types of things should not be happening in the United States of America. So
Yeah, and thanks to the Jones Act, we can't ship it from the
can't
Gulf of
ship it
Mexico,
either.
right?
Yep,
Yeah,
yep.
insane.
Yep, it's really crazy. And these have like real life implications for
Yeah.
people.
Oops, we've lost your sound. I think you accidentally hit mute.
Sorry, I think I
That's okay.
accidentally muted
That's all
myself.
right.
So there are real world implications for people in the Northeast that are, paying double and triple what other parts of the country are, and relying on heating oil, and they are just a few hundred miles from one of the most prolific gas basins in the world, and they can't get that American made, affordable, reliable natural gas just a few hundred miles to the north. It's just crazy.
It fits right in with my energy absurdity of the day on LinkedIn.
That's a good
amazing.
one. It's amazing.
Holy cow. So this half hour is flying by here. We have a few minutes left. Looking back to the elections, what outcome of these elections is the biggest point of concern to you? If you had to pick one thing, what would you say it is? Did I lose you?
No, I'm thinking. You sent me this question. Okay, we have to cut this part out, okay?
No, that's okay.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right.
I think the biggest point of concern is how polarized this country is getting. And I think this gets again to where we started this, which was, this was really an election for incumbents. And while, we saw, luckily Republicans won enough seats to win the House, but I just think what you're seeing is an increasingly polarized Congress, an increasingly polarized electorate. And that just makes it harder to find common sense solutions to some of these very real problems. And I think that that's what, most of America really wants.
Okay, so yeah, and I completely agree with that. I started lobbying out there in 1995 when members of both parties actually played golf together and went out to, their families socialized together. And it was such a better environment for compromise and real solutions. But anyway, what about the opposite of that? What's on the positive side? What's the most encouraging thing you saw happen in the midterm elections?
Well, I will say divided government is going to be better than what this industry has seen for the last 2 years. I think that is certainly a positive. And I think a lot of the pro oil and gas Democrats who we have worked with over the last few years got reelected. So Henry Cuellar, Vicente Gonzalez, Lizzie Fletcher, and those were seats that, I think were very much in question going into the election. And so the Democrat energy champions that we do work with, were able to win and come back, and that should be helpful for the industry being able to try to build some bridges moving forward.
Well, I can't help noticing all three of those members of Congress you mentioned are from Texas, so God bless Texas.
Amen.
Thank you so much for coming on, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you. I hope we can do this again and make it a recurring thing in the future.
Absolutely, David. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
And thanks also, of course, to Stu Turley of the Sandstone Group for hosting our podcast, to Eric Burrell, our extraordinary producer, and to Inveris, our sponsor. We couldn't do this without you guys, and really appreciate all of you. For the Energy Question, I'm David Blackman, and that's all for today.